Welcome, everybody. I'm just going to get started now. And again, if anyone pops in, we'll welcome them when they come. So welcome to week 6. You should have received an email for the, good morning, for the handouts, I think this morning, but the link is, as always, is in the chat. So if you want to grab that, you should. If anyone doesn't have any writing utensils close by, I would like everyone to grab one. We have a couple activities today, so it might be helpful to have ahead of time. You can use your phone too if you'd like, or just something to write stuff down would be great. Okay. So as usual, I'd like to start us off this morning just by checking in and seeing how people are going and if anyone wants to share a mindful moment that they had this past week. I think for myself, I've been really enjoying the fact that it's been sunny and warm out. So spending time outside and getting some sun and just enjoying the sound of the birds and just feeling that warmth on my face. That's such a nice feeling. Noticing the flowers. That's great, Bethany, that you've been able to notice. Yeah, notice your feelings, label them, and it does make them less overwhelming. I'm really happy to hear that's been working for you. That's great. Noticing flowers, awesome. Yeah, everything's starting to bloom finally, which is awesome to see. It's beautiful. Great, Kristen. Stepping out of that automatic, like kind of autopilot mode, and yeah, labeling your feelings. That's great. I'm really happy to hear that people are connecting with the materials and kind of being able to use them practically in their daily lives. I mean, that's the whole point of these things, right? Is to make sure that yes, you can listen to them, and the webinars are great to learn, but if you aren't able to apply them to your daily life, then I mean, they're not really that helpful. So I'm glad that people are noticing a difference, which is awesome to see. Okay. So this week we're going to be talking about making the best of it, and learning how to recognize our emotions and again, their effect on our life, which is the first step of learning how to manage our emotions and our emotional reactions better. So very often people spend their lives paying really little attention to how they really feel. I think some of us can relate, especially after last week about maybe the fact that they don't really notice their feelings all the time. And so when we start talking about noticing our feelings and labeling them, it can be really helpful in terms of making them feel better and making us feel better as a whole. As a result of that, when we don't notice our feelings often, there are a lot of important things happening inside us, that we don't really know much about, because our emotions and our feelings and the way that we think and feel really determine our internal world, right? They shape our internal world. So if we're not tuned into that, if we don't really understand what's going on in our internal world, then we don't really understand what's going on with us and what's going on in our lives. The same holds true for people who are struggling with overwhelming emotions, but it might occur in just a different way. So very often people struggling with their problems recognize that tidal wave of emotions and that overwhelm that overcomes them, such as the sadness or anger, guilt, and shame. But by the time they recognize that this overwhelming wave is happening, it's really too late to do anything about it, or it's already become overwhelming and too big to handle. Again, to help manage your overwhelming emotional reactions, it's really necessary to slow down the emotional process so that it can be examined before it gets to that peak or that tidal wave point. So using what when we talked about last week, that stop technique, is a really excellent tool to help make better decisions, I guess, in regard to choosing to respond over reacting. And again, I think a lot of us in the chat can relate to being in that point of, noticing our feelings and labeling them, and seeing a really big difference in how we've been handling them. And I'm really happy to hear that. Okay. So thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. What's the difference between these three things? Quite often, we get these three things mixed up. So for example, if someone asks how you feel, you respond, I feel like people don't understand me. So this actually isn't an emotion, right? That's a thought. We often mix up behaviors and emotions as well. You might think it's not good to get angry, but you're probably thinking of it as the behavior that results from anger. And I think we talked about this a little bit in one of our sessions before, in the sense that anger itself isn't the bad thing. Anger is just the emotion. When we fear anger, or we get frustrated by anger, it's because of the behaviors that come from being angry usually. So it's okay to get angry, but again, when we have the reaction of yelling or throwing things because we're angry, that's where it becomes problematic, and that's a behavior. So we tend to mix up how we feel, think, and act, mainly because these three things are really closely connected. So this diagram that we have on the screen here shows how our emotions impact our thoughts and behaviors, how our thoughts impact our emotions and behaviors, and how our behaviors impact our thoughts and our emotions. So in every situation we experience, these three things are all kind of interconnected and happening at the same time, and integrate to kind of create a bigger picture for us. So we have thoughts about what's going on, we have feelings about what's going on, and we also behave in a certain way depending on what's going on. Add the mix of all these three things, and this can happen pretty quickly. It's no wonder we often get them confused, because again, they all are kind of might be happening simultaneously. So to be more effective in managing our emotions, we need to learn to separate these three things. Before we explore this a little bit further, in order to, again, help us manage our emotions better, it's important that we acknowledge the following. Just because you have a thought or an emotion, it doesn't mean that it's true. You might think, I'll never be good enough, but that's just a thought and it's not the truth. So another way of saying that is that it's an opinion rather than a fact. So you might have that sense of feeling unloved, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you truly are unloved. It's just how you feel in that moment. And our thoughts and feelings often seem really true to us. We really kind of put a lot of stock in our every thought and every feeling that we have. But it's also really important to remember that they're just thoughts and feelings, and there are opinions and are based on our perspective and our own experiences, but they're not necessarily facts. Does anyone relate to that idea or struggle with that idea that maybe our thoughts and our emotions aren't necessarily fact? And Aaron, I want to say, just because they feel, that doesn't mean that they're not real. Just because they're not fact doesn't mean they don't feel real, right? They're just as valid as anything. When we have a feeling, when we have a thought, they're valid because they're ours. And they do feel absolutely real. But I think it's important to, again, acknowledge like that, where does that thought come from, right? Do you have something to back up that thought? Or is it really just because of previous experiences and just a general lack of, maybe, I mean, when we feel not good enough, there's reasons for that, right? If we can look back on our lives, we can probably find reasoning behind our thoughts and our feelings about ourselves. So I think it's more about understanding that, yeah, when we have a feeling and we have a thought, that, okay, recognize it, acknowledge it, don't dismiss it, because it's important and it's causing us to feel, it's causing a reaction in us. So obviously it's important. But then to also recognize, okay, well, where does this come from? And is this really a fact? Is this a true statement? Or is this an irrational thought that I'm having because I'm upset, or I've gone through something, or maybe somebody said something to me earlier that day and it just made me feel bad, right? So there's often other reasons why those thoughts may come up, or that those feelings may be coming up. Yeah, sometimes our thoughts are kind of like the word delusional. I don't like that word, but yeah, they are. We are definitely, sometimes we think in irrational ways. We get really caught up in our own thought process, and our own experiences and our own perceptions of things. And I'm sure we can all relate, when we're feeling bad about ourselves, when we're having a bad day, everything seems bad, right? And that goes back to that attention bias that we were talking about before, in terms of, when we're starting to notice, or when we constantly think difficult things or constantly expecting the worst, that really does make our perception of our lives towards the negative end. So we tend to notice those things more. And absolutely, it's hard to put those thoughts out of your mind when you're so used to it. And when you're so conscious of those things that people have said to you. It really does, especially if it comes from childhood, or it's something that was a really significant moment for you. Those thoughts, or those feelings that are evoked from that time, can stick with us, and they become part of our own internal dialogue. So it's no longer an external thing, it's become internal. And that's why it makes it really hard to cope with and manage, because again, it does feel like it's true to us. It feels so real. It feels so, so true. But when we kind of look at it a little bit deeper, it's like, well, no, it's not true. We're not always, if you feel like a failure, there's probably tons of examples that you can give yourself where you're not a failure, or that sense of not being good enough. Well, you are good enough just because you're a human being and you're here and you're living, right? I think the expectations may be unrealistic, or maybe, the standard that you're holding yourself to might be too high. But we have to examine. It's just I guess a good time to mention, to be curious about these things that we think about ourselves. And yes, they feel real, and yes, they're valid. But just to notice them, and again, kind of dive into them a little bit deeper, to know if okay, am I feeling this way because it's true, or is it just a feeling and something that maybe comes from the past, that I have to just deal with and work through. So yeah, that was just a little kind of interlude in there. But yeah, I think it's important for us to acknowledge that it's sometimes our thoughts and our feelings aren't always necessarily the fact. So observing without judgment is something that is going to be really important. So you may find yourself thinking about all of this and think that you don't really judge yourself or others. But what's the problem with this? You're still increasing the amount of discomfort you have with when your judgments are turned inward. So many of us have experienced bullies in our lives to one extent or another. So when you're judging yourself, you're being a bully towards yourself, right? But this is not unusual. This is actually quite common. And you've probably heard the saying, we're our own worst enemies, which is completely true. And what that means is that we often have a more difficult time being kind to ourselves than to others. So when you're judging yourself, the results are the same or even more damaging as if you were being bullied or judged by somebody else. So it's really important that we start to notice what the rewards are of all of our behaviors, especially the self-destructive ones. So at the same time, we also have to remember that we shouldn't criticize or judge ourselves if we discover unhealthy rewards reinforcing our behaviors. It's not wrong to admit that some of our behaviors need to be changed. You can still be good, kind, loving, and like a nice person, despite needing to have to work on things or change a couple of things. When again, going back to that attention bias, sometimes we feel if we acknowledge that maybe there's something about us that we need to change or work on, that can feel all encompassing. And it can feel like that makes us a bad person, or and we overgeneralize and kind of make an overarching statement about ourselves. But in reality, acknowledging that we need to change is just that, right? I'm a work in progress. I'm always going to have to be working towards bettering myself and kind of doing things to manage my feelings, manage myself, and work through things as I go through life. So if we have something that we notice that's maybe an unhealthy habit, or maybe not a great behavior that we would like to change, it doesn't mean that we're bad. It just means that we just have to work a little and put a little time in. So your behaviors probably exist, those unhealthy ones that we want to change, because you were never taught how to deal with your overwhelming emotions in another way. If you had been shown a healthier way to deal with your emotions, you'd probably be doing that right now, and you wouldn't be struggling with them as much. But that's what this is all about. So it's about discovering healthier ways to cope with our big feelings. So notice how action changes both our body language, posture, facial expression, and actual behaviors. So opposite action isn't about denying or pretending an emotion isn't happening, but rather it's about managing those feelings. So I'm sure we can, again, relate to the idea of when we have a thought or emotion, or we're starting to feel a certain way, our body starts to change. We start to, maybe our posture changes. Maybe if we're sad, we kind of are slumped, our shoulders maybe kind of come round a little bit more. We might cross our arms to kind of close off if we feel uncomfortable or feel vulnerable. Our body really is expressing itself quite naturally, based on what our thoughts and feelings are, because again, these things are all connected. Your facial expression might change, right? So things are happening maybe that we aren't necessarily always 100% aware of. So it's important, again, to notice those things and to be able to work through those. And if you notice that your posture is changing, like if you're feeling kind of sad, maybe it's about, okay, I'm going to push my shoulders back and I'm going to open up a little bit more rather than closing off. If you notice when you're angry, you kind of shut down, you get your face kind of scrunches, you close your body, open your body, relax your face, right? So if we can start to notice these things, we can start to influence how, because again, if all of these things are connected, then if we open our bodies, if we kind of scrunch our face and relax, then that's going to send a signal to our thoughts and our emotions to be like, okay, well, maybe we're not as angry as we thought, right? So there's just different ways that we can kind of tackle the problem. And again, because all these three things are connected, it's important that we work with all of them as well. So again, by what we talked about earlier, by acknowledging the emotion, and use the opposite behavior, it can help reduce or encourage a new emotion. So for example, if we feel really angry, and we want to kind of like slam something down, maybe hugging something or petting your pet, so being soft or having a soft behavior might be helpful in reducing our anger, if that makes sense. And again, encourage a new emotion to come up. So in that example, if we want to throw something or punch something because we're angry, but we pet our pet and we're just kind of in that moment and we're soft and caring towards our animal, that can induce those feelings of care and love, right? So just about finding in the moment, I guess, opposite behaviors that might help induce a different feeling. So I haven't changed the slides yet. That was just that one. So we are going to we're going to step into more of an activity kind of based the rest of the day. So I want us to kind of get into a good headspace. So I would invite us all to do this meditation, just to kind of get us grounded and maybe thinking in a different way. So again, feel free to close your eyes if you're comfortable. Feel free to just enjoy this next 5 minutes. And I hope everyone can hear this. I'm just going to press play. I'm just going to close my eyes and enjoy it, and I'll see you in 5 minutes.
Hello, and welcome to this quick guided meditation to slow down and be grateful. I'm Sarah Raymond with the Mindful Movement. I'm grateful you have joined me today. It is so easy to become swept up in the seemingly relentless demands of a busy life. In doing this, you might find that you lose focus on the present, or you might feel as though you don't have the time to stop and appreciate life's gifts. It is true that meditation is a practice, and it can create change when you make the time to practice it. But even when you are short on time, it is important to prioritize what matters most. You can always find time to be mindful, even if just for a few minutes. You might find that closing your eyes to tune out the outside world for a moment makes it easier to bring your awareness inside. So you may choose to close your eyes now. And let's begin this practice with some gentle breathing. Notice the rhythm of your natural breath. Take in a slow breath and experience the gentle rise and fall of your chest. Our breath is constant and reliable. It tethers us at all times to the present moment. Just by tuning in to the steady rhythm of your breath, you are immersing yourself in the energy of life, the energy that propels you forward and connects you to all other life on this planet. Observe whether your mind is in another place or if it is here right now. Can you allow yourself to let go of your thoughts for a moment? Can you allow your mind to be silent, except for hearing the sound of your breath? Now, notice where you are carrying tension in your body. Can you allow your clenching muscles to let go? Ask yourself, how do you feel in this very moment? Can you sense the peaceful energy of life flowing through you, invigorating you with every breath? You are the embodiment of this lively energy. Your body is a miracle and a gift, the vehicle through which you have the privilege of experiencing this beautiful world. Take a moment now to find something or someone to appreciate. Sense the feeling of gratitude within you. And send it outward to the world around you. In a moment, you will open your eyes and come out of this state of stillness and peace. But do your best to move forward with your day with a residual feeling of gratitude. As you continue on with your day, I challenge you to continue cultivating gratitude. Perhaps you can even find something positive out of an experience that seems negative at first. Now, we will end this practice with a deep breath, breathing in love and breathing out eternal appreciation. Thank you for practicing with me today. I am grateful that you did. I hope you have a joyful day.
Okay. So take a minute to kind of come back. Okay. So after that, I would like us all to, and this is where our paper comes in, or just whatever writing utensil you decided to grab. I'd like us to take a minute to jot down a few positive qualities about yourself. I'm just going to take a minute to do that. Are people finding it hard to find some positive qualities to write down about themselves? Is this a more difficult task than you expected? Hmm. Right. So I think we can, like, obviously we're relating to the idea that, or we can think of some things, but then maybe after we get to that point of thinking of a couple good things and we start noticing, okay, well, then this is, we kind of counteract our good stuff with some bad stuff. Or again, that self-doubt that comes up when we start thinking about our positive qualities, we start to doubt ourselves and say, well, is that really true? Right. And it doesn't that suck that we feel that way, that we can't even acknowledge when we acknowledge ourselves, or when we give ourselves a little bit of a compliment or pat on our back, it's always kind of followed up with, but are you sure? Or is that really true? Or that self-doubt, or maybe a negative quality, or, oh, but this, during this one time 2 years ago, you didn't act that way, or you weren't that way, right? So we can always find kind of evidence to counteract those nice things that we think about ourselves too. So some people might struggle to bring these nice things to mind. And this is again because of that attention bias. We really struggle, or have a tendency to pay attention to the unhelpful things that might confirm our negative view of ourselves. But we rarely pay attention to the positive things that we do. So our positive qualities, the positive outcomes that we have, or the positive comments that we get from other people. So this will make our positive aspects really hard to get to at first, because we honestly don't really take stock or take notice of them ever. And again, or we do, or when we do notice them, we immediately follow that up with a negative thought. Well, others of us may not have had trouble recalling any positive things about ourselves, but even when you recall them, or when you can write them down, it still might feel uncomfortable thinking about, or talking about, or even writing them out. Um, So you might feel like, well, if I'm writing down my positive qualities, if I'm kind of sitting here thinking about all the things I'm good at, you might feel like you're being conceited or arrogant, or maybe stuck up to think about such things. Does anyone feel that way? Does anyone relate to that idea of feeling that we're kind of being indulgent or arrogant or full of ourselves if we kind of acknowledge the things that we're good at? Okay. So if either of these things apply to you, so that feeling of we can think of good things, but then we feel selfish or conceited or full of ourselves when we do think of them, or we can think about them, but we, again, self-doubt, or we kind of counteract them, or we just really struggle to think of them in general. This will help you, or this approach, I guess, will help you have more of an open mind about these things. And we're going to start asking ourselves and just start noticing the positives in ourselves that we often ignore, and to start acknowledging these positive things. So remember, most of the time all you pay attention to are your negatives and the negative qualities, and we feel comfortable really dwelling on these negatives. And again, it kind of goes back to that belief when we talked about self-compassion, that belief that if we focus on our negatives, then we might be more motivated to change, or what by acknowledging our problems or our faults, then will be that helps us move forward or to fix them, right? But when we stay in this mindset of being critical of ourselves, it can really be damaging. And I think we've noticed that for the past couple modules about the influence that our thoughts have on our emotions and our behaviors. So I think it's important to ask yourself, like, how fair is it to stay dwelling on these negative qualities? How fair is it to yourself to do that? Do we think that it's fair to dwell on our negatives? By getting you to start to acknowledge your positive qualities, we're starting to tip the scales of our self-evaluation back into a more balanced state. So these scales obviously have been quite off, right? If we're kind of tipped more towards the negative end, and this seems like this might be a pattern for some of us, that we tend to be constantly in that imbalanced state of, like, we focus on the negatives, but we don't ever really acknowledge our positives. And yeah, that fear of being conceited, or that fear of being, full of ourselves or just arrogant is something that we probably always have in the back of our mind. And again, that prevents us from being kind to ourselves. I think something we have to remember is being able to acknowledge our positive qualities doesn't mean that necessarily we have to share that with other people and be like boasting and say, I'm so good at this or I'm so good at that. And not that that's a bad thing, because we should acknowledge what we're good at. But if that's the worry, if that's the fear of, like, well, I don't want people to think I'm full of myself or conceited, well, why can't you just keep that to you, for you? Keep those positive qualities so you acknowledge that for yourself, but it doesn't always mean that you have to go around talking about it with other people. So in saying that, it's like, where do we start with this, right? How do we start to build a better kind of acknowledgement of those positive qualities, rather than kind of having that imbalance of noticing more of the negative stuff? So when we notice something and it's really important for us to remember it, what is it that we do to help us remember? Does anyone do anything in particular, if they have something that they really need to remember or to want to remember? What do you do usually to help you remember that? Write it on your hand, okay? Right. I know for me personally, I'm kind of old school in the sense that I like to write things down. So I like to have a physical calendar. I like to jot down and write down my notes. In school, I always wrote my notes out by hand, because again, it really cemented it in my head. And once I wrote it down, I would remember it. Even if I wasn't looking at my calendar, I could still remember it. If I don't write it down, it could go in one ear and out the other. I could think about it and then it's gone right after. So when we write things down or make a note or make a list, that helps us remember. Like a to-do list, writing in your agenda, always having a notebook, right? Writing it on your hand. So if these are tactics that we use in regular life to be able to remember things, do you think that the same approach could be applied here? So if we want to start acknowledging our positives and remembering them and kind of having them in our minds more solidly, do you think by writing them down it would be helpful? for Aaron, I would wonder what if you wrote down something nice about yourself on your hand every day? So then it would be a constant reminder. I don't know if that's pushing it a little bit, but I mean, it's an idea, right? Did anyone have any kind of initial reactions about the suggestion of writing things down? And even when I asked earlier for you to start writing it down, was there any sort of resistance or feelings of anxiety, maybe some shame, uneasiness, sadness, fear? Right. Afraid of people seeing it. Absolutely. That makes sense. I mean, that's kind of it's very, I guess writing it down in a notebook or on a piece of paper at home is different than writing it on your hand. Absolutely. But yeah, great. I'm glad that there wasn't any issues for you, Kristen. And if you did feel anxiety about writing down your positive qualities, or even writing just in general, that makes sense, right? We're kind of tapping into something that we don't normally do, we're not accustomed to. So it's going to make sense that we might feel a little bit uncomfortable with it at first. I'm sure some of us can relate to the thoughts of, what could I possibly write down? I have nothing worth writing down. Me, positive qualities, what? That doesn't even make sense. Or did anyone else notice kind of initial thought or reaction that they had when I said to write down positive qualities? Like, what was the first thought that you had? And was it more of a critical thought? Great, Cindy. It's great to hear that. I mean, that you are proud of who you are and that you have been engaged in gratitude. That's awesome. But it's interesting that again, even in that moment, right, when I asked to write things down, you could really only think of a couple things, and it really took you some time to think about them. So even if we are engaged in this process kind of regularly, if we engage in mindfulness quite often, or even gratitude, sometimes we still struggle to acknowledge our positives, regardless of where we're at in that journey. And we could be proud of ourselves and feel comfortable with who we are, but yet still struggle to acknowledge our good qualities. So there's always a little bit of resistance, I think. And I think that was a great example. So thank you for sharing, in terms of, yeah, being able to say, you know what, I am proud of myself. I'm a good person and I have good qualities, but then still struggling to give a list for that. Yeah. So that's where we kind of need to really listen for those negative self-evaluations that come through, and that tendency that we may have to discount or minimize anything positive about ourselves. This kind of nasty habit that may rear its head when you try and do this exercise. So again, when we try and write down our positives, if we notice those kind of really self-limiting or self-critical thought processes, it's really important to acknowledge that and to notice them and be like, okay, I'm having some self-criticism, I'm feeling a little bit of resistance, I'm struggling with this, and just acknowledge it and move on, right? And actually just try and participate in the task at hand. Right. So being able to recognize positives in other people and not ourselves, again, I don't know. I have a few hypotheses, I guess, about why that is. I think that might come from a little bit of comparison, in terms of we're kind of on constantly looking at others and kind of gauging where they're at, to kind of manage ourselves, I guess, or to fit in, or to know where we fit, I guess. So if we're constantly kind of comparing or adjusting our behaviors based on what the energy in the room is or who's around, right, that helps us fit into the situation and fit into the group. But then that also kind of creates maybe an outer perspective, and constantly looking outside of us rather than being able to acknowledge our own stuff. This can also come from when you were a kid, right? That other people were constantly being acknowledged, but never you. So you learned to acknowledge others, but you never really learned to acknowledge yourself. So there's lots of different reasons there that could be at play, but I think we can all kind of relate to that idea of we're able to notice positive qualities in other people, but we struggle when we are asked to do it for ourselves. So I would like us to start a positive qualities record. So this is making a list of the positive aspects of yourself, including all your good characteristics, your strengths, your talents, your achievements. And you might want to start a record of this in maybe a journal, or maybe just like a set aside as kind of a special place for it, one that's dedicated especially for this task of focusing on positive qualities. So some tips to kind of get started here is when you record something in your positive you journal, make sure you set aside a specific time and really be intentional about that, and commit to the task and carry it out. So don't just do it on the run or while you're doing other things and be kind of mindless when you're doing it, or fit it around other activities. Really try and give it the time that it needs. It doesn't have to be a long time. It could be 5 minutes, 10 minutes. But it does need to be given its attention and its time on its own without having the distractions of other things. So when writing these things down, make sure, other than making a mental note or writing something on the back of a napkin or a piece of paper, right? When we write in a special place, it makes it so that we know exactly where to find it. And again, because we know where it is, we likely are going to remember it a little bit more. So again, we also won't lose them if we're putting it in a specific place, like a certain journal, or maybe you have a little notepad by your bed, or whatever the case may be. If it's in a specific spot and it's in kind of a book, or it's bound together in some way, you won't ever lose it. Well, hopefully not. You can still lose things, but but hopefully it's better than just having it on a loose piece of paper or the back of a napkin. We also want to, when you're doing this and you're starting this positive view record, or you're writing down your qualities or your strengths, your achievements, you want to write as many as you can. There's really no limit. And again, by doing that and by writing as many as you can and seeing how many you can get, it goes back to that idea of pushing past that resistance that you might feel of being conceited or full of yourself. So acknowledge that thought might be coming up, like, oh, if I write too many, then I'm going to look full of myself, or I'm going to feel conceited. But push past that thought, because that's just an irrational thought that we might have because of something we were told a long time ago, or a belief system that we developed as kids because of our parents, or whatever the case may be, right? So it's important that when we do this, to evaluate all avenues and brainstorm as many ideas as possible. And if you run out of steam, just take a break and you can come back to it. And this might be something that maybe you incorporate into your week. So it might be something that you every night or every morning or every afternoon, whatever time works best for you, sit down and you write down maybe 2 or 3 things onto the list, and you really sit and brainstorm. And when you do that, you can read over the list that you've already created, right? So it becomes part of your kind of daily routine in helping you, yeah, just notice more of the positives that we have rather than kind of focusing on those negatives. So it's also important not to discount even the smallest things that we feel are positive about us, and notice those thoughts of kind of that negative self-evaluation of it's too small, or it's not that big of a deal, or it's not worth writing down because it's just like, it's so minor or whatever. So remember that we kind of are constantly in that negative attention bias. So we tend to do, like I said, we're kind of minimizing our positives every time we come up with one, because we're so used to that. That's just our natural kind of default mode. These also don't have to be qualities or things that you do perfectly all the time. That's impossible. We have to be pretty realistic when we write things down, in the sense that if you write down that you're hardworking, but you might recall a time in the past where you weren't hardworking. But again, and so you might decide, okay, well, that's not true. And I think we talked about that earlier in terms of that self-doubt, right? We start to question whether or not it is true, that quality that we have. But that one instance or a couple instances don't mitigate your entire kind of career or hardworking time. So if we have to kind of have that attitude that we have to be fair to ourselves and realistic, and notice, like, look at the bigger view of things rather than just a couple incidences where you may not have been hardworking, but notice how many other days and weeks and months and years that you have been hardworking. So it's also important not to just do this exercise for the sake of it and then put it in the drawer and never see it again. It is important that when you do this exercise and when you take the time to write these things out, that you reread them and you, again, write more if you come up with more. And again, like we said earlier, when we write things down, we remember them. So it's important to go back to it and look through it and kind of use it almost as a mantra, and help ourselves to really, take these things in and start to have them become more of a normal thought pattern rather than just a fleeting thing that we might think of or be acknowledged when someone else acknowledges it in us, rather than acknowledging it in ourselves for ourselves. Thanks, Cindy, for that exercise that you said you do with your kids. Awesome. I would be curious, do you do that for yourself? You ask your kids to do it, but do you engage in that exercise with them as well? And do you tell them? Maybe you can, I mean, if they're writing it down, I don't know, or if they're kind of talking out loud, but do you participate in that exercise? I wonder how it would feel for them to see their mom engage in that activity with them, and to hear how you're proud. You're guilty. Yeah, I wonder how it would feel for them to hear you say positive things about yourself, and to know that you are proud of yourself and your achievements, right? So yeah, just something to think about. I'd be curious how that would feel for you. Definitely have to avoid that analyzing piece. Absolutely. Like we said, when we have those negative self-evaluations all the time, it is really hard to get into the habit of kind of not allowing that, noticing that analysis, right? Noticing those thoughts that come up and maybe that resistance that you're feeling, but then again, noticing it and being like, okay, that's just my natural default mode coming into play, but I don't need to acknowledge it, or I don't need to go down that hole. I just have to keep moving forward and keep doing these positive lists. I'm really loving that everyone is into stationery as much as I am. I love notebooks. Chapters is my favorite place, like the notebook section. Love it. It's the best. Yeah, I hope that everyone is interested in kind of taking this on and maybe doing this a little bit, and incorporating it into their lives. That's funny. Yeah, honestly, any sort of stationery store, I get really caught up in all of those things, like even like Sharpies and things like that. I really love those. So maybe when you decide, once you have that list or that record kind of that you have in a special place, it might be helpful to look at it every day. Maybe in the beginning, when you're still kind of feeling a little bit uncomfortable with it or uncomfortable with the process, that it might be something that you look at all the time. And then I wonder how it would feel to look at it every day. And then once you start to kind of have that thought process in your regular mindset, maybe you move it to, maybe you look at it every week, at the end of every week, or maybe at the end of every month or the start of every month, you take a peek at it again, just as a refresher or reminder. Maybe it's something you go back to when you're having a really shitty day, excuse my language, and you're just like, I just really feel like I need a pick me up. So when you open this book and you see all these good things about yourself, it might help you to feel better and to remind yourself that one bad day or one bad moment isn't the whole picture here. There's so many other things about you that are wonderful and that are good and lovable. And so that it can help kind of manage those difficult feelings. So again, it's just about letting these things sink in and really becoming part of your natural thought process, and being able to notice these things and feel more comfortable in acknowledging them, rather than just kind of saying it on offhanded, or again, waiting for somebody else to acknowledge it in us, and rather than, acknowledging it ourselves. So our workbook this week, it actually does contain a positive self-reflection journal to help you start thinking about these topics. But I'm loving that everyone's thinking about getting a notebook to do this. So absolutely take that and run with it. But yeah, if you need some help getting started with this, there is that in our workbook today. So after talking about this a little bit more and examining that idea, noticing maybe where barriers come into play when we do think about this, does anyone have any more qualities that they would like to write down on their list that they first did? And if you do, you should do that now. Thanks, Cindy. Take care. Okay. So we mentioned, I think it might have been Cindy that mentioned gratitude, but another way to kind of cultivate more positive thoughts about ourselves and about others and the worlds and the lives that we live is about cultivating gratitude and a sense of thankfulness or appreciation for what we have. So there's actually studies that have shown that gratitude can really increase our sense of quality of sleep. So that means that subsequently we're less tired. It's related to better moods, feelings of more self-efficacy, as well as actually decreased inflammation in the body. So again, I think it's about that sense of what we talked about earlier and I think it was in like week 3 or 4, about how when we start having overwhelming emotions, our rational brain shuts off and we go into fight, flight, or freeze mode. That inherently is inflammation, right? That's causing stress. It's causing our adrenaline and our stress hormones to be released, and that is inflammation. So when we're able to be in gratitude or in mindfulness, we're actually bringing everything back online. We're turning off that fight, flight, or freeze mode, and we're able to kind of get our, like, I don't know what we call them, but kind of those rest hormones or to stop the influx of those adrenaline hormones coming into our body. So when we're in a state of gratitude or start to practice gratitude more frequently, like I said, our brains are less likely, to engage in that negative attention bias. So the practice of gratitude can actually help us combat some of our negative beliefs that can be associated maybe with depression. So gratitude is also associated with increased sense of well-being. And this means increased mood and a decreased in a negative affect, higher life satisfaction, feelings of mastery over our environment, personal autonomy, purpose in life, and personal growth. So all these factors combined, when we have this sense of increased life satisfaction, increased mastery, it kind of relieves us of depressive feelings, and again, increases our immune function. So it really does have positive physical benefits as well as mental benefits. No problem, Lori. Take care. Enjoy. I hope everything's okay. So again, this idea, kind of what we talked about in week 3 about when our thoughts kind of signal our brains to be in that danger mode or that threat mode, this signals a cascade of reactions that initiates that fight, flight, or freeze, and then our stress response, which creates hormones, and again, it creates inflammation. So these 2 techniques about, well, one in general, just mindfulness skills, but then incorporating like positive qualities and also gratitude, this can really help us in being able to notice that soothe system come back online and decrease our inflammation, decrease our stress, and increase that sense of relaxation and maybe peace of mind. So as we wrap up today, I really would like us, again, to take time and just write out maybe, what you're grateful for today. What are kind of, maybe start with 5, 3 if you're really struggling, but what are you grateful for today?